Hello, my name is Philip Hancock and I'm a Professor of Work and Organisation at Essex Business School at the University of Essex. This talk, entitled The Organisation and Business of Christmas, was originally presented as part of the Economic and Social Research Council's week-long Festival of Social Science, an event that aims to bring the work of social scientists, such as myself, to a wider audience. Okay, so having given you the title, the first question that probably needs to be answered is, why is a Professor of Work and Organisation interested in Christmas? Well, two reasons really. Firstly, I'm sure that anybody who has walked or driven through a town or city centre during the months of October, November and December will have noticed that Christmas, as a shopping event at least, is clearly a very important matter. Alongside the civic lights and decorations, the shops and stores are decked out and making the most of what is traditionally known by retailers as the Golden Quarter. That is, these 3 months when retailers experience an often vital uplift of anywhere between 25 and 60% in annual turnover, one that is in fact often very necessary for their very survival. So from my perspective at least, it is apparent that Christmas is clearly big business and as such worthy of consideration. Secondly, and again, as I'm sure many of you will know, it is this very intensity of economic activity that has also led to the objection that Christmas, as an ostensibly religious celebration, has become too commercial. It's become too fixated with spending and consumption, and in turn too pressured and organised. And certainly, from my point of view, this is a very fair observation. In order to simply get through Christmas, many individuals and families find themselves having to approach the season more as a military operation than a time of relaxation and goodwill to all. But what particularly interests me in this respect is the possibility that Christmas has always, from its very inception, been an organisational and commercial event. Certainly this might be something that has become intensified or more pronounced over the last 150 years or so. But nonetheless, what I want to suggest here is that in order to understand the festival that is Christmas and how it has come into being, we also need to understand its organisational and commercial dimensions, both as they have unravelled throughout history, as well as how they continue to define our experience of the season today. Okay, so where to start with this? Well, what I'd like to do is start with what one might call a brief organisational history of Christmas. Now, the majority of academic historians of the season agree that as a celebration or festival, Christmas begins with humankind's response to the cold and dark of winter. Across the Northern Hemisphere, which is the primary focus of this talk, human communities and civilisations have, since their earliest days, organised midwinter festivals of fire, light and often hearty consumption in order to ease both the fear and burden of the annual privations of the season, as well as in turn celebrate the turning cycle of the sun as the days cease to shorten. Now, moving forward in history, by the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, the most important of these were the Roman winter festivals of the Saturnalia, the Calends, and what is known as the Natalis Solis Invicti, meaning the birth of the unconquered sun, a particular festival that celebrated the winter solstice and the victory of the sun god over darkness. Equally importantly for those of us in Western and Northern Europe, it was the Nordic festival of Jule or Yule that marked the midwinter in a similar fashion. Now, what characterised all these events, apart from their timing of course, was hearty feasting, drinking, decorating houses and buildings, and to a lesser or greater extent, gift-giving. But all of these activities relied on the significant mobilisation of food stocks, fuel, lights for fires, and in many cases the labour of large numbers of slaves and servants. Indeed, in what even today would sound to be a very familiar observation, the Greek sophist Libanius wrote of these Roman celebrations as a time when the impulse to spend seizes everyone. He who the whole year through has taken pleasure in saving and piling up his pence becomes suddenly extravagant. He who erstwhile is accustomed and preferred to live poorly, now at this feast enjoys himself as much as his means will allow. So in many respects, while the origins of such festivals were largely cultural and spiritual, they also required from the outset the organisation of scarce economic resources, such as food, fuel and indeed labour, while commercial transactions undoubtedly underpinned access to many of these events for the populace. Now, it wasn't until around the mid-4th century AD that these Roman winter festivals in particular became identified with the birth of the Christian saviour, Jesus of Nazareth. Now, why this happened is open to some speculation, as certainly prior to this, Christians had largely considered the celebration of a birthday as itself something of a pagan activity. It would certainly seem, however, that issues of political and social organisation played a significant part. For at this time, Christianity was still very much establishing itself as the state religion of the Roman Empire, subsequent to the conversion of the late Roman Emperor Constantine. As such, prominent Christians were involved in an ongoing struggle for the minds and souls of the Roman people, especially its powerful military, and this was against the already ancient and well-established pagan religions. As such, in the eyes of prominent Christian leaders of the time, offering a new faith that, in effect, would deny the people their traditional winter revels was frankly never going to sell. So by superimposing the celebration of the Christian nativity over the established practices of the Roman festivals, the ambition was to leverage the season in order to render Christianity more palatable, both to the masses and the power brokers of the empire. It was, in effect, what we might know today as an exercise in social and political marketing for the new Christian church. And as the organised church spread out across Western and Northern Europe, beyond the remnants of the empire, Christmas continued to play something of a lost leader role, shall we say, for this emergent transnational Christian organisation. For example, in 601 AD, Pope Gregory instructed his missionaries in England not to simply forbid established pagan activities and festivals, but rather gradually turn them to the worship of the Christian God. Thus, local festivals such as Yule increasingly offered the native populations continued opportunities to indulge in established rites and rituals, including the adornment of their homes and halls with greenery, feasting, and what came to be known as making merry, while increasingly emerging them with a celebration of the birth of the Son of God rather than that of the Son that is God. This relationship between Christmas and the development and maintenance of powerful organisational structures did not end with the growth of the church, however. Throughout its history, Christmas has played a notable role in the propagation of state and other related interests in society. In 16th and 17th century England, for example, the function that Christmas could play as a potentially powerful medium of social cohesiveness was not lost on the powers that be. Elizabeth I, who was well regarded for carrying on her father's observation of Christmas celebrations, featuring the organisation of lavish banquets, plays and other revelries, was also known for insisting that her nobles return to their country seats at Christmas in order to, and I quote, keep hospitality amongst their neighbours. But this was no arbitrary exercise of royal power, but a very measured action designed to ensure loyalty and order amongst her subjects, who benefited annually from noble largesse during the season. And then by the time we reached the 19th century, Christmas had become a significant tool in the making of national identities and the promotion of state interests. From the adornment in early illustrations of the new figure of Santa Claus in the American flag, to the importance of the season for promoting British imperial unity, illustrated here by the making of the Empire British Christmas pudding, with all the ingredients sourced solely from, as you might have guessed, the countries of the British Empire. The ability of Christmas to promote common cause and sentiment continued to provide a powerful medium of propaganda and socio-political organisation. Okay, now before I move on, one thing that needs to be acknowledged is that this very brief overview that I've just given you of the historical evolution of Christmas is one that must be considered as somewhat partial. Now, what I mean by this is not so much that it has largely focused on the season's commercial and socio-political aspects, however true this might be, but that this focus has also led to what is a very much geographical specific idea of what Christmas is. What I mean by this is this refers to the Christmas that has come to be known in much of the literature as the Anglo-American Christmas, which in turn has come to dominate much of the world. The origins of the Anglo-American Christmas can be dated back to the early 1800s. While the Victorian societies on both sides of the Atlantic represented great economic success stories, the need was emerging for something that could help address many of the problems also being generated by this very success. Amongst these were the problems of family breakdown, urban poverty, and the social disruptions that these could generate. Of equal concern, however, was the realisation that in an economy increasingly premised on industrial production, there was an additional need to create a culture in which industrial-scale consumption could also thrive in order to maintain economic as well as social stability. For some, this came to mean one thing: that Christmas had to be revived as a predominantly commercial event. And while in certain respects this might represent a somewhat restricted interpretation of what happened at the time, it is, on reflection, hard to refute. Christmas cards, crackers and domestic trees were all either invented or popularised by leading Victorian entrepreneurs or public figures. Add to these the growth in ever more elaborate decorations, the emergence of manufactured rather than handmade presents, wrapping paper, and even the rise to popularity of the childhood gift giver, Santa Claus. And by the late 19th century, Christmas had become well established as a hive of new forms of economic activity, all of it geared specifically to the season. And not only was more being made and sold, of course, that goes without saying, but also people were working and shopping longer into the day and into the night in order to both fulfill and create the demand for Christmas. In the US, for example, the great New York department store Macy's first opened until midnight on Christmas Eve in 1876, while in the UK, the world's first Christmas grotto, replete with the new commercial position of in-store Santa Claus, opened at Lewis's Bon Marché store in Liverpool a couple of years later. And as the 20th century marched on, not only Christmas, but the very possibility of celebrating Christmas became increasingly indistinguishable from the commercial activities that surrounded it, with many of the season's most enduring cultural icons not only features, but indeed products of the commercial landscape. The modern image of Santa Claus, that, as I've already pointed out, 19th century contrivance, was, as a good example, perhaps most famously adopted by the Coca-Cola Company in 1931 through the illustrations of Haddon Sundblom. And while, contrary to some stories, Coca-Cola did not invent the image of Santa in his red and white suit, the company was certainly responsible for sending this image around the world, sedimenting it in the minds of a global populace. Similarly, Santa's interloping ninth reindeer, Rudolph, was originally a storybook character written in 1939 by Robert L. May for the Montgomery Ward chain of department stores. The story was simply a promotional device until it was later popularised in the song of the same name, first recorded by country singer Gene Autry. Since then, the character has become central to the shared mythology that defines Christmas for people of many faiths and nationalities around the world. And what of Christmas today? Well, however else we might like to see it, the Anglo-American Christmas and its core value of consumption has resulted in what can be described as an increasingly global mega festival of Christmas, commerce and organisation. As I've already alluded to, retail is perhaps a sector that benefits most from the high levels of economic activity at this time of year. As one manager of a major shopping mall explained to me, they expect to do around 60% of their business over the 3 months of October, November and December. By virtue of this fact, it is also the sector often with the most to lose. Dependency on a 3-month window for trading survival is dangerous for any business, as recent failure stories in the UK, such as camera store Jessop's and video chain Blockbusters, have shown us, with each of these folding directly after the festive season. Nonetheless, despite the risks, the rewards can be significant, with the expenditure figures of this period appearing quite astounding. In the UK, for instance, the average consumer spends around £800 on Christmas each year, with overall Christmas sales that only being the sales between mid-November to the end of December, equaling a total spend of around £72 billion in 2013, with around 15 billion of that, which is about 20%, spent online. Of course, however important it might be, the contemporary world of sales and consumption in these 3 months cannot be easily isolated from a cycle of annual activities that go simply beyond selling. For many major retailers, Christmas begins on January the 2nd as travel plans are put into place for the sourcing and purchase of Christmas stock and decorations. And this is from fairs and events around the world. Plans for the recruitment and training of staff, the decoration of stores and the provision of Christmas events are usually firmly in place even before the last set of decorations have been taken down. As one senior manager I spoke to in a retail marketing department admitted to me, for her, it's Christmas all year round. Furthermore, and as most of us know, what must be consumed must also be produced and traded. And increasingly this takes place, again, within a global marketplace. China, in particular, exports on an annual basis around $15 million worth of artificial Christmas trees and $150 million worth of Christmas ornaments, all to the USA alone. And in doing so, they create vast global supply chains and logistical operations, without which Christmas, as we have come to know it, simply wouldn't happen. Indeed, and further illustrating the global nature of the festival, so dominant is Chinese manufacturing in relation to the production of Christmas goods and gifts, particularly for the West, that last year this resulted in a news article in the Chinese People's Daily Online asserting that when Americans in particular wake up on Christmas morning, it should be a Chinese Santa Claus they are thanking for their gifts. At the same time, the global celebration of Christmas, predominantly as an exercise in consumption and gift-giving, has become increasingly prominent. This is true not only in countries with strong colonial links with, say, the UK, such as India, but also in the large Eastern economies, such as China and Japan, where shopping malls are adorned with Western-style decorations and stocked with both specialist Christmas items as well as targeted luxury goods from very early on. Even brands such as Kentucky Fried Chicken have gotten in on the act, claiming to offer authentic Western Christmas lunches to Japanese consumers. Lunches that have become so popular that they have to be ordered weeks in advance of the big day. And finally, production and consumption, as one senior London store manager confided to me, now seems to have come full circle, as Chinese retailers come to cities such as London to purchase Christmas decorations from upmarket stores, only to then sell them back in what is most likely their country of origin. Now, having said all this about consumption and retail, production and whatever, what we also need to remember is the importance of labour in all of this. Christmas, after all, provides a huge boost to the global economy by virtue of the seasonal work that it creates. For example, a major retail store such as Selfridges can advertise for around 1,500 extra staff. And that's just over the Christmas period, while supermarket giants such as Asda frequently take on between an extra 7,000 and 10,000 seasonal staff. And more global figures suggest similar trends, with their overall numbers for additional Christmas employment in the US, for example, averaging around 800,000, while the production and distribution of these goods and services engulf even more of the global workforce. Perhaps one of the most important and interesting of these seasonal employees, of course, is the Santa Claus performer, the man who helps out the real Santa Claus in shopping malls, shops, and other sites throughout the Christmas period, as well as standing in for him in a variety of other roles. For every year, the image of Santa Claus, or as we still frequently call him in the UK, Father Christmas, is one that adorns billboards, magazines, TVs, and other assorted commercials. It's an image used to sell everything, from cookies to cameras, from sofas to software. More importantly, however, for around 2 months of the year, he is not simply an advertising or marketing image, but a man of flesh and blood who is spoken to, laughed with and believed in as he appears in the store grotto or perhaps on walkabout on the city streets. Now, these Santas themselves do not come cheap. As a major supplier of UK Santa Claus performers told me, a major store or shopping centre grotto can cost anywhere between £25,000 and £150,000 to install and run. And for that, the owners would expect a footfall of between 10 and 30,000 people every year. Having spoken to many of these performers myself, however, what strikes you is the seriousness they often bring to their roles. Often retired or semi-retired actors, many of them are professionally managed by PR or theatrical agencies, some of which specialise only in Christmas events. The best of these attend annual Santa schools and even universities, and these are run throughout the UK and the US. Here they are trained how to continue what they see as the proud heritage of the role, while managing at the same time the competing demands of giving care and attention to each child they meet, while ensuring that the necessary commercial throughput through their grottos is maintained. These men invest in bespoke costumes and acquire a great deal of knowledge about the character and even those mythologies most recently associated with the character. For example, those that emerge on a daily basis through Hollywood movies. And they do this while adhering to a strict set of ideals regarding the sanctity of who it is they represent. And for those who not only perform but are actually able to truly inhabit the role, financial rewards can be well above the average. Major London stores, for example, pay between £30 and £40 an hour, depending on experience, appearance, with real beards attracting a premium, and the number of days they work. In my discussions, higher rates were also reported for those performers chosen to work at the many corporate Christmas parties held especially in the City of London, as well as what are often very exclusive private events, with tales being told of chauffeur-driven journeys to the high-security homes of Russian oligarchs and even Arab Gulf princes. Not that these performers didn't earn this money. Service work at Christmas can be, at the very best of times, deeply taxing and demanding high levels of patience and emotional compliance. For these men, however, the responsibility they felt to stay in character, whatever provocations they might face, added additional layers of exertion and emotional labour. And believe me, such provocations took many forms. Now, sometimes these simply involved listening to heartbreaking tales of children, sometimes suffering from bereavement or family breakup, and then asking Santa to put things right. But even this required intense acts of emotional control on the part of the performers, who had to be seen as appropriately reassuring and jolly, while often holding back very real tears. At other times, however, such emotional self-management was required more to contain fear and anger rather than grief. Many reported a decline in what we know as traditional grotto settings for their work, and an increasing requirement that they walk around stores and shopping malls. And this often left them not only hot and uncomfortable, but also vulnerable to abuse, both verbal and physical. Indeed, one performer even recounted his experience of an attempted mugging, a situation he managed to eventually defuse by explaining to his would-be assailant that everybody knows that Santa Claus is like the Queen. He doesn't carry money. But alongside such stories of abuse, there were also common tales of attempted press stings, long hours, poor changing and working facilities, and processes of intensification that resulted, as one performer recounted, in having their helper elves, whose primary responsibility was to look after them, suddenly seeming to be telling him every few minutes to speed up getting the visiting children through the grotto. Such performers, and often their agents, are not, however, the only people who increasingly make the bulk of their annual income from the season. Christmas not only supports a host of mainstream industries, as I've mentioned, such as retail, the logistics, marketing, and the like. But what's interesting is that it's now also spawned its own, often unique economic sector. As an example, let's take the Hall in Abbey Cum Here in Powys. This 19th century Gothic revival mansion in mid-Wales, while open all year round to visitors, comes into its own over the Christmas season. Decoration of all its 53 rooms begins in October, and during the months of November and December it welcomes over 3,000 visitors, which in turn provides nearly 55% of its annual footfall and turnover. Or another example on a larger scale is Lapland UK. This was the brainchild of a retired city trader, and what it seeks to do is closely appropriate the Finnish Christmas identity in order to offer a more convenient destination for UK and Western European visitors. And now in its 8th year, Lapland UK employs around 250 staff, can hold between 8,000 and 10,000 families per season, and has an annual turnover of around £2.5 million. Now, what I've recounted here probably sounds relatively positive in economic terms. But there are other sides to this that we need to think about. For in an age where the importance of conducting business on an ethical and sustainable basis is something we must not shy away from, there are also difficult questions to be asked about the costs and consequences of such business activity. Perhaps, not unsurprisingly of course, information and insight into what one might call the dark side of Christmas is pretty hard to come by. After all, who wants to be read, let alone be the festive party pooper, the Scrooge, the Grinch? Nonetheless, reports such as the American National Labour Committee's A Walmart Christmas, which was published in 2007, demonstrated the use of child sweatshop labour at the Chinese Guangzhou Gift Company. This was used for making Christmas decorations, primarily for the US market. There, it found some employers were paid as little as 26 cents an hour, at the time half the legal minimum wage in China, and that often young employees were amongst those particularly at personal risk, required to handle potentially toxic chemicals with little or no protection. And in a different vein, but nonetheless disturbing for that, are those reports that have highlighted the environmental waste and destruction that Christmas brings along in its wake. The Australian Conservation Foundation has estimated, for example, that in order for its country folk to keep a style of Christmas loyal to its colonial ancestry, they spend around $1,500 million Australian dollars on household electrical goods. But that even before these appliances have been plugged in, they had generated 780,000 tonnes of greenhouse pollution and used over a megaton of material in their manufacture. And similarly in the UK, Greenpeace have calculated that around 1.7 billion Christmas cards are sent each year in Britain alone, and that this works out at the destruction of roughly 200,000 trees, just in order to service this particular aspect of Christmas. And equally horrifying, perhaps, is that it takes around 1.3 kilograms of coal to produce every 1 kilogram of wrapping paper, with the process emitting 3.5 kilograms of CO2. And none of this even includes the carbon footprint of packaging and transporting this around the country. And as well as such matters, which of course should be of real concern to us, there are other aspects of the season that also demand our more critical attention. As I've already suggested, it is at the interface between the realm of commerce and organisation and the everyday practices and values of people at Christmas time that we might also encounter some difficult questions that need to be considered. For the move of Christmas from the public to the private sphere, from the street and hall into the Victorian family home, was one that was not achieved without cost. For example, as families became even more self-sufficient and dependent on a formalised division of gendered labour, it was often for the mother or wife to realise what increasingly was becoming a high expectation about the standard of the ideal family Christmas, leading to a situation now where rates of post-seasonal divorce are double the yearly average and are complemented in the worst possible way by emotional breakdowns and even suicides, all of which have become a blight on the immediate aftermath of the season of love and goodwill. I think going back to the question of business, however, we have to ask ourselves, where do these expectations come from? Well, in large part, of course, they come from the range of commercial media resources that claim extensively to be the solution to such idealised expectations about family Christmas. Certainly from the late 19th century onwards, a proliferation of commercial magazines, books and pamphlets have appeared, urging the good lady of the house in particular to ensure that each calendar year would culminate in the best Christmas ever. In order to do so, they provide tips, tricks, and most importantly, goods and services that are indicative of how a proper traditional Christmas should be resourced, organised and spent. Today, magazines in the UK, such as Signature Publishing's The Christmas Magazine, carry on this tradition, asserting that their publication is, and I quote, an essential read for the woman who wants to make their Christmas at home a memorable occasion. And as I've noted, while the average individual spend at Christmas is around £800, readers of their magazine, or so we are told, spend around £1,300 just to make sure that they live up to the expectations raised by their festive read. It's not, however, simply print media that is now there, ready and waiting to assure that you can organise the best Christmas ever, however. Websites such as Organised Christmas or Christmas Countdown vie to provide you with planning tips, gift ideas, and charts and record sheets to make sure that everything goes according to plan. And if you are still not sure how much time you have and how to keep on top of things, then of course don't worry, because there's always an app for that. Similarly, Christmas places huge financial and organisational burdens on a host of public and voluntary services as they try to keep pace with the increase in demands for their services during the holiday period. The UK NHS, for example, has to deal with a seasonal average increase in deaths of around 2,000 people, many of which occur due to increases in traffic accidents, fires and falls, many of which can be ascribed to high levels of festive intoxication. Indeed, believe it or not, every year around 1,000 people are injured by their Christmas tree, and because of this require hospital treatment. Things are not much better for our pets, with animal rescue and protection organisations such as the RSPCA estimating that they see around 3 pets abandoned every hour over the Christmas period. And returning to more human problems, homeless charities such as Crisis have to mobilise around 10,000 volunteers every year to care for around 4,500 to 5,000 homeless people in major UK cities alone. While, again at the same time, shelters for victims of domestic abuse also have greater demands placed on what are already limited resources by the annual seasonal spike of abuse in the home. So to conclude, in one sense what I have offered is a fairly straightforward idea, namely that if we look at the celebration of Christmas closely enough, we can see that it has always had a highly organisational and admittedly increasingly commercial character about it. In its earliest days, it was charged with helping to sell the value and practices of Christianity from Rome to the farthest corners of the empire. More latterly, it was rediscovered as a means of boosting the Victorian economy and spreading the fruits of industry to new markets, both here and across the oceans. Today, we have reached a point where few around the globe have not heard of or indeed do not practice Christmas in one form or another, be it as consumers or indeed producers. But this is not to say that this is an entirely uncontested state of affairs, of course. There are those who have always opposed either, or frequently both, the secular and commercial character of the season. In 1893, for example, George Bernard Shaw wrote, "It is really an atrocious institution, this Christmas. We must be gluttonous because it is Christmas. We must be drunken because it is Christmas. We must be insincerely generous. We must buy things that nobody wants and give them to people we don't like. We must go to absurd entertainments that make even our little children satirical. We must writhe under venal officiousness from legions of freebooters, all because it is Christmas. That is because the mass of the population, including the all-powerful middle-class tradesmen, depend on a week of licence and brigandage, waste and intemperance, all to clear off its outstanding liabilities at the end of the year." something that perhaps many of us are familiar with as an idea today. And today, indeed, there are many campaigns that still oppose Christmas. Examples today include the Christian-led campaign against what has been termed the war against Christmas. This is what's perceived as a secular business movement, who Christians claim wish to extract any Christian significance from the event in order to be able to sell it more widely. But it's not just Christians who object to aspects of what has become of Christmas. In a similar vein, anti-consumption organisations such as Adbusters run an annual Buy Nothing Day on the same day as Black Friday in the US. Or more recently, there is Occupy Christmas, which champions a celebration of the season based on exchanging homemade gifts and buying provisions locally. However we approach the season though, what is clear is that Christmas is not only here to stay for the foreseeable future, but that due to the power of international trade and commerce, it is likely to become more globally significant than it already is. Yet this should not mean that the values that continue to be used to legitimise the season, care, goodwill, generosity, and indeed sharing, should be abandoned. Care for the planet and others could become part of the Christmas expectation when sourcing and buying Christmas decorations and gifts. Goodwill to others could be extended to all those who make Christmas possible. Those who work for us, produce for us, serve us, care for us, and work with us. Generosity of spirit, as well as of our wallet or purse, can once again make the exchange of gifts a truly meaningful experience, while finally sharing can re-emerge as something you not only do with a tin of Quality Street, but with the organisational burdens and personal opportunities afforded by the season, not just at home, but wherever you can. Thank you.